All right, welcome back. It's a new video. I wanted to put on record a few thoughts that I've had around the parable of the fig tree and what that might mean in terms of, the return of Christ. Maybe throwing some figures on it. I've had some thoughts on this. I'm sure many other people have had these thoughts as well, but these are the first times that I have had them. So I think it's interesting to kind of just put it down and see what you guys think and gals. Okay, so the fig tree generation was something that Jesus spoke about in uh, the Olivet Discourse. So in Matthew 24, he spoke about the part. He said, "Learn the parable of the fig tree. When its branches have become tender and it puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize that He is near, right at the door. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." So it is a prophecy. Because he says, "I say unto you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place." So it's all part of the Matthew 24 Olivet Discourse, the prophecy of end times, and so on. So the fig tree generation, he talks about the generation will not pass away until these things take place. So we know from biblical typology that the fig tree is Israel. When Jesus was walking back towards Jerusalem, he saw the fig tree from afar and he walked up to it and there was no fruit on it. And he cursed the fig tree at the root. That itself is is pointing back to prophecies in the Old Testament, or where was it in Zechariah where the I can't remember where the tree was cut at the root anyway. But either way, the fig tree is Israel prophetically in the Hebrew Scriptures. When it puts forth leaves, you could say that that's when the population starts to come. So the fig tree could be national Israel, and when national Israel puts forth leaves again. Remember, we've just come from the story where Jesus curses the fig tree and it dies right in front of their eyes. So before he was put to death on the cross. But anyway, so the fig tree was put to death, and now Jesus is talking about when this fig tree comes back to life and puts forth leaves. So you know that Israel, it's Israel, national Israel was last destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. And this obviously Jesus prophesied that too. Um, but he's talking about when this fig tree comes back to life, and we know that Israel, national Israel, came back to life politically anyway, not spiritually, but politically they came back to life in 1948, in May 1948. So Jesus talks about the generation. Truly, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So the generation that sees the fig tree come back to life we'll see all those things. We'll see all the previous things that he spoke about in the Sermon on the Mount, or sorry, the Olivet Discourse. So, can we put some figures on that? So, we know that a generation has to be something. It has to be a period of time. But we can go to Psalm 90, and we can see Moses puts let's say some figures on a lifetime or a generation. It says Psalm 90:10, he says, "Our days come to 70 years or 80 if our strength endures. But yet the best of them are but trouble and sorrow, for they quickly pass and we fly away." So he says it's either 70 or 80 years. So this generation, if it's 70 years, 1948 plus 70 is 2018. So we know that it wasn't 70 just through evidence, because Jesus didn't come back or the Daniel 70th week didn't start in 2018, and Jesus didn't come back. So to gather his saints, as he said he will, with a great trumpet. So the generation that sees these things must be 80 years, or maybe it's possibly 80 years. And if it's 80 years, that goes to 2028, more or less. Now, many people have have suggested that the fig tree generation foretells the beginning of the final prophetic, week of years in Daniel's prophecy. 70 weeks have been allotted for you and your people. But it's possible, well, many people have said, right, that, or we, let's say that those of us who are interested in prophecy kind of thought about the idea that maybe this 70 or 80 years pointed to the beginning of that final 7 years of trouble before the Messiah comes back. And well, if it's 28, if it's the beginning, then it's 80 years. 2028 begins the final 7 years. But the biggest, let's say, most important, apart from his return himself, the biggest thing that Jesus pointed to in the Olivet Discourse was the abomination of desolation spoken through the prophet Daniel. The abomination of desolation is when the Antichrist figure goes into the newly reconstructed temple or whatever it is standing there, um, and he takes it over and he destroys Israel, basically. Um, and we actually know when that happens. We know that happens at the 3.5 year point. He comes in and he destroys the covenant. That covenant that was Daniel spoke about, Daniel 9:27. He comes in and he breaks the covenant, and he performs that abomination of desolation. He goes into the temple and he calls himself God, basically, because he has destroyed Jerusalem and he is taking over Israel and he is God. That's what he says. We know this from Revelation. If we go to Revelation 12, sorry, Revelation 13, he says the beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies, to exercise its authority for 42 months. So 42 months is 3.5 years. 3.5 years is halfway through seven, the final 7 years. So we know that this is the midpoint. It opens its mouth to blaspheme God and to slander his name and his dwelling place and those who live in heaven. It was given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. So he's given power to conquer Israel. He's given power to wage war against God's holy people and to conquer them. And he was given authority over every tribe, people, language, and nation. So we know that this happens halfway through this final 7 years, this tribulation period. Jesus himself called it the Great Tribulation. So we actually have two time points now, two time steps. And we know that Jesus is speaking a lot about this abomination of desolation and what you should do and shouldn't do if you're in Israel. You should get out of there, he said. Well, the abomination of desolation happens halfway through, and we have, like, from Moses, we have a period of 70 or 80 years. Well, we know we're not talking about 70 years now. We know we're talking about 80 years, and we know that from um, Revelation, we know that Israel loses its sovereignty to the Antichrist, and that's the key. He loses its sovereignty. Israel loses its sovereignty. The Antichrist takes over Israel. He's given power to wage war against the holy people. He goes into the temple in Jerusalem and he takes it over. So that means at that point he has taken over Jerusalem. That means at that point he has conquered Israel. Now, that just gets so interesting when you look at the historical context of that 80-year period. Because if we go here to an article in the Jerusalem Post, and it's about, article is actually, it's entitled 75 Years Old is a Dangerous Age for Israel. So this is what the article states, and this is proven history. And President Herzog of Israel was talking about this, and former president, can't remember his name, was talking about it, and even we have here previous Prime Minister Naftali Bennett was talking about it as well, about the 80-year period and how they can't let it slip out this time. Can't let this sovereignty slip from their fingers this time. So the President Herzog wondered whether the state would reach 80 years. And here we read, the united monarchy of David and Solomon is said to have lasted not much longer than 100 years. Saul, David, and Solomon. David and Solomon, the monarchy of David and Solomon, that's the one continuous rule, that um, that lasted about 80 years. I think it was about 70, was it 70, 79 years or something like that. It's said to have lasted not much. So the whole period through Saul, David, and Solomon was 100 years, but David and Solomon itself was about 80 years. And then they fell apart. They split into two kingdoms. The sin of Jeroboam. Um, the Hasmonean dynasty ruled from 140 to 63, and Pompey of Jerusalem occupied Jerusalem, or Pompey occupied Jerusalem, and that was 77 years. So we have a period of just less than 80 years and a period of 77 years. So we have two previous um, political Israel, two periods of sovereignty for the nation of Israel were ended by 80 years. And here we have Psalm 90 talking about 80 years. And here we have Jesus talking about the fig tree generation, 80 years. And he's saying this is when Israel is going to lose its sovereignty, because in Revelation, Jesus says that the Antichrist goes in and takes over Israel, basically. So we have a point in time where Israel loses its sovereignty again. And I'm going to bet that they lose their sovereignty before 80 years is hit. So let's do some math. We have Israel, let's say the prophetic resurgence or resurgence of national Israel in 1948. So it was May 1948, so it's 1948.4, let's say. So Isaiah 66 says, can a nation be born in a day? Yes, Israel was born in a day. And we have Matthew 24:15, the abomination of desolation, and we know that happens at the midpoint of that final 7 years. But can we put a date on that? If we have born in a day, and we know that Israel should not reach 80 years, so we have 1948 plus 79, let's say, brings us to 2027. Say, let's say halfway through 2027. So could that abomination of desolation happen halfway through 2027, where Israel loses its sovereignty? So we know that when the abomination of desolation happens, that is when Israel loses its sovereignty. And we know from history that Israel lost its sovereignty twice previously before 80 years hit. So if that's halfway through this final 7-year period, then we dial back 3.5 years from there and we get to, let's say, November, December 2023, which is quite interesting. Does that final 70th week begin in November 2023? That's a thought that I had this week. Basically, it centers around the fact that Israel loses its sovereignty by 80 years. We know when Israel got its sovereignty back. Therefore, we add 80 years, and that gets us to the point when Israel loses its sovereignty, which is the midpoint of the tribulation, which is when the Antichrist goes in, takes over Jerusalem, takes over the temple, proclaims himself to be God, performs the abomination of desolation by proclaiming God in the temple of God. So, 2027, it's going to be an interesting year, nonetheless, if we're still here. Does that mean roll back 3.5 years? We get to 2023, November 2023. I'll see you in November. I'll do another video and I'll wipe away those thoughts that I just had. But anyway, it is an interesting bit of math and with an interesting historical precedent, let's say, in the two previous versions of national Israel. never lasted 80 years. And here we are again. We know the point that Israel loses its sovereignty because Jesus told us Israel loses its sovereignty when the Antichrist walks into the temple and takes over. Interesting times indeed. God bless. I'll see you in another video pretty soon. Bye bye.